Well, are you gonna play that over and over?
I have 2 songs in my playlist. I have this game still play, and then I have the Love Is a Losing Game.
Okay. You might have to play them again, but just be emotionally ready for that.
Yep.
Right on. People are joining. Hello, people who are joining. If you're joining, set your chat to speak to everyone and type in your name and organization and where you're joining from and put in your favorite board game. And could somebody do that as a favor to us so I know that the chat is working? Like just as a nice favor, not the panelists, someone who's joining us. Thank you, Sophie. Hi, Sophie. Right on. Well, Sarah Hoffman, you're going to love Benchmarks this year if you like Clue. Oh, I like some oldies and some newies. Ticket to Ride, Sushi Go. People love Sushi Go. Wingspan. Ticket to Ride. I love Ticket to Ride too. Really into King Dominoes these days. If you haven't tried King Dominoes, you should play King Dominoes. That's a fun game. If you're joining, please go ahead and put your name and your organization, where you're joining from, and your favorite board game. Make sure your chat is set to everyone. See some people just messaging the host and panelists, which is cool. We like it, but set it to everyone and everyone can see. Sneaky Snacky Squirrel. That's a great name. Right? Sorry. Sorry.
Ben, you don't have to apologize, that's fine.
That took me a minute. Right on. So many great people joining. So nice to see all of you. And it's also so nice to see old friends joining and old colleagues. Ben, to see you. I don't actually see anyone, just to be clear. I can see you're in the chat. It's all a one-way camera situation. Right on. We have a lot of people joining, so we're gonna take some time to let everybody get in here. There are so many great organizations that are joining us today. It really is nice to see all of you. It really does feel like we have this community of people joining today, people who care about these metrics and the work that they represent. And oh, hello, Philip King from my past, and Bianca, former colleague. I can't say hi to everyone personally. It starts to sound like Romper Room for those of you who are old enough to remember Romper Room. We'll probably start in about 1 minute. So you need to get a glass of water. You don't want to miss a single word. This is your moment. If you're just joining, I think you can see in the chat name, organization, where you're joining from, and your favorite board game. Right on. Code names. I love code names too, Katie. I actually like all games. I think this is true. So I'd probably say this to everyone. Five Crowns, right. Not as many Settler of Catans as I thought there would be. This is like another little piece of data we're collecting as you type in your games. It's just another reference point for us. Trivial Pursuit, old school. You're gonna like this. You're gonna like our benchmarks this year too. The person who said that. Right on. Right on. You're just joining. Got another minute or so. Probably less than a minute. I think it's probably 30 seconds at this point before we start. Name, organization, where you're joining from, and your favorite board game. Right on. All right. The song is over, which I think means it's time for us to get started. Don't stop doing what you're doing, though. Please keep putting your name and your org and all that jazz. And just let me say first, thank you so much for joining us today. Benchmarks Day is always an exciting day for us at MNR, and I think a lot for a lot of you, given the response that we're seeing. And it's not only because we get to wake up to this delightful gift of data, but we also get to celebrate the people and the organizations whose work that data represent, and that means you. If you're somebody who is participating in this webinar right now, that includes you. This is what this work is, nerdy and detailed, but it's also about the work and the causes that they represent. Um, so feel free to give yourselves a hand while we get started on this year's study. My name is Madeline Stanionis, and I'm joining you from San Francisco, California. I'm a partner here at M&R, and this is my 12th benchmarks. And I'm pretty sure that this is the best one yet. We have a lot more this year. We have more participants than ever before, and that means more data. So we have lots more data, but even more than that, we actually have new categories of data that we've added to the study, which we'll highlight throughout today's presentation. And that makes the useful info in this study even richer. And by the way, we also have a UK and Ireland segment this year. And for folks in the UK and Ireland segment, your study will launch on June 27th. So you can register for the webinar for that. And we're going to drop a link in the chat. So as you probably know, we don't just create a study every year. We make it a whole damn thing. And we use a theme and all sorts of fun stuff around it. And this year's theme should be pretty obvious to you by now. It's games, games, games. And so in addition to the data and lots of it, you'll find games throughout the benchmarks book. There's a fun clue game that I'll let you find for yourself. There are prizes if you solve the mystery. And this morning, we just launched benchmarks this morning, and we already have a dozen people who have solved the mystery, which we are gobsmacked. Thank you for participating in our silliness. There's also trivia, some of which we'll solve during today's webinar. And yes, there is actually a real board game, Benchmarks, the game. It works. You can play it if you get the book. It folds out of the back cover and it has all the instructions. And if you participated in Benchmarks, you helped make that game. We asked some questions of you that we included in the game. We asked questions about what can really ruin your day? What really makes your day? Who are some of your heroes? We included all of that in the game. So this is sort of a crowdsourced game. And we also actually made an entire boxed board game. There are a few of them floating around if you come to any of our parties. And you probably saw that board game if you saw our commercial. And we'll post that commercial link in the chat if you haven't seen the commercial. It was really fun. If you come to our party this afternoon in DC, we will have some board games there and you'll be able to actually play it. And if that makes you want to come to the party even more, again, we'll put a link in the chat about how you can actually come to the party. For those of you who are new to M&R, making benchmarks is just sort of par for the course of who we are. We are a consulting firm. We're about 170 people strong. We love nonprofits. We believe in nonprofits. We believe in the work that you do, and we think it's critical to advancing the cause of justice and alleviating suffering and solving all the greatest challenges that we face. And there are so many of them right now today. The kind of work that we do is whatever it takes to help nonprofits bring attention to a cause, raise money, run campaigns, whatever it is, we are capable of doing it. So if you haven't worked with us before, please check out our website. Benchmarks is a big, important part of what we do, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of people here at M&R work on benchmarks, and we are graced with some of them today, including Adia Ali, Jonathan Benton, Teresa Bujold, Sarah Coughlin, Alex Hudson, Liam Mancuso, and Will Valverde. And we like to have lots of folks speaking because there's lots of different kinds of categories of data, and we want those experts to be able to really give the best commentary. So it's not just somebody reading the slides to you, it's somebody who really knows what the heck they're talking about. We are recording this webinar. So when you logged in, you saw that we were recording this, and we will share it with all registrants within about a day or so. And everything that we're presenting today is also on the website, mrbenchmarks.com. If you want a print copy, you have to join a party in person, either the one today or the one in New York in May. So if you want a print version, you got to join a party. But if you just want all the delicious data, the fun jokes, the endless puns, you can find that all on the website. And it's a pretty great looking website this year, if I do say so myself. You will probably have questions as we chat, and that's cool. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen, not the chat. The chat is really for chatting amongst yourselves, comments, compliments, heckling, whatever you need to do. Remember to set your chat to everyone, not just to the hosts and panelists. And starting with, if you haven't already, sharing your name, your org, and where you're joining from today, and your favorite board game. Couple last things before we get going. First, to all folks on our call today who are observing Passover, happy Passover. I did practice saying that in Hebrew, but I'm not very good at it, and I think I would embarrass myself. So I'm going to say happy Passover. And if you're coming to our party this evening, we will indeed have Passover-friendly fare, along with vegan and gluten-free fare as well. All right, just a little bit more here. And it's not a little bit, it's a lot bit, which is our 225 participants this year. We would not be anywhere without your amazing and generous participation. If you participated, please say so in the chat. And everyone, as you see folks' names outing themselves as participating, please use the reaction feature at the bottom of your screen. Is there a reaction feature? Maybe there's not. Well, please provide applause in the chat. It is a lot of work to participate. We know that. We ask a lot of questions. We ask you to provide a lot of data, and we are deeply grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone who participated. And of course, now is the time that I should say that participants actually have the option of receiving both the book and the board game. So if you want the full thing as a participant, you will have or have already received an email with your shipping address. So please feel free to fill that in. The board game comes in a whole box. It's a whole thing. And I think that is enough pre-game chatter before we get going. I'm going to turn it over to Will Valverde. Will Valverde is Benchmark's primary writer, and he's going to kick us off today. Will.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Will Valverde. I have been the lead writer of Benchmarks since 2013. It's always a lot of fun. I'm really, really excited about some of the stuff we've been able to add this year that we've not been able to look at before. So there's a lot to go through. I'm going to get to the charts in a second. We're going to ease into it. First, before we actually get into the charts, a couple of things just so you know a little bit about our methodology that's important to help you interpret them. First, Madeline just gave us a little preview of all the wonderful participants who joined Benchmarks this year. We separate them out by sector. So when we look through the charts, you'll see an overall average for a particular metric, and you'll see it broken out by sector. Our participants are self-selecting into sectors, so we give them a choice of, are you a rights group, are you an environmental group, and they decide where they make the most sense. If they don't fall into any of our categories, they are other. On some of the charts, you'll see some of the sectors drop off. So you may not see public media represented on every single chart. When that happens, it's because we didn't have enough data for that particular metric from enough participants to give a reliable average for that sector. So that's why that's dropping off. We also break out our participants by size. So by size, we measure that by the size of their online annual revenue. So those with online annual revenue up to $500,000 are classified as small. Between $500,000 and $3 million online in 1 year, that counts as medium, and anybody raising more than $3 million online is classified as a large organization. So that should help you find your peers and the right comparisons for you. The other thing I'll say is whenever we talk about averages, we are talking about the median average. So that means that's the group right in the middle. Half of participants are showing a result higher than that number, and half will be below that number. And then finally, when we look at year-over-year comparisons, a lot of what we really want to look at are those trends, those changes over time. It really helps us set our context. Whenever we are looking at year-over-year comparisons, we are looking at this year's participants and looking back at their historical results. So we're not pulling out last year's study and putting them side by side. It's a different pool of participants, so that wouldn't be a good apples to apples comparison. That was a board game joke, apples to apples. Okay, we're going to ease in, like I said, into the numbers. So we're just going to look at one number right at first, and then we'll start looking at some of these charts, so it's not too much all at once. First of all, the big number, the first question that we ask ourselves, and that I think most people ask when they open up Benchmarks, is what happened to overall revenue? That one big number, it was relatively flat last year. So overall revenue between 2022 and 2023 declined by 1% year over year. Of course, we want to see growth. It's not fun to see a red number here instead of a green number. We want to report that. But I think for a lot of groups, holding steady in this current environment when so many things are so difficult feels like a victory. So if that's where you're feeling like, ooh, not a lot of change, you are very much not alone. The 1% decline, again, represents the median figure for nonprofits across all sizes and sectors. That's our big overall average. As with many of our metrics, we saw a fair amount of variation when we break things down a bit. So we're going to take a look at that now. The basic story is some sectors saw an increase in revenue. Yes, and this is by calendar year, the question in the chat. So we're looking at the year-over-year change between calendar year 2022 and calendar year 2023. Some sectors saw an increase in revenue, some saw a drop. And all those changes were in single digits on average. That's pretty much what we're seeing. The biggest growth came for public media nonprofits at 3% and 4% higher for the health sector. So relatively small changes there. At the other extreme, disaster and international aid nonprofits saw online revenue decline by 7% on average. So that I'm really like, oh, what's going on with disaster international aid groups? This is now looking 1 year past the year-over-year change between 2021 and 2022, so 1 year before. And that same sector, disaster international aid groups, they had the greatest increase in that previous year. That's the period that coincided with the escalation of conflict in Ukraine. So as the Russian invasion escalated, as that conflict began, and as the humanitarian crisis really grew, there was a really great generous response from donors across the world and across the country. And that showed up in that change between 2021 and 2022. So we had that higher baseline. The decline that this sector experienced last year is from that sort of elevated baseline. I think this happens a lot when we're looking at the year-over-year changes. There's this temptation to be like, well, what happened in 2023 that drove these numbers? And very often the answer is actually about what came before, what established sort of the baseline that we were measuring that change from. So here, I think a great example, you're looking at the hunger and poverty drop-off 18% 2 years ago. They had an additional 4% decline last year. And so the question is like, what's happening with those groups? We're going to look at that in a second, but spoiler alert, it's not because nonprofits in the hunger and poverty space forgot how to fundraise all of a sudden. This is the first time that we've been able to include revenue from direct mail in benchmarks. I think it's really exciting just to give us a sense of scale and a better picture of what's going on. You know, these programs are not happening independently for most of our participants. Whether the revenue is coming in through direct mail or online, it's all going toward the same cause. So we really want to get a sense of that scale. On average, nonprofits raised slightly more revenue through online channels than through direct mail last year. For every $1 in online revenue, nonprofits raised 94 cents via direct mail. I think that gives a good sense of scale and how nonprofits are having to balance investments and staff time in these different channels. We're going to dive deeper into the fundraising stats in a minute. First, I want to shift focus a little bit and talk about peer-to-peer texting, which I expect to be a really big part of organizing and mobilizing strategy for a lot of folks as we head toward election season. So again, we're talking about peer-to-peer texting here. These are the one-to-one conversations we can do. This is not the mobile messaging sort of like broadcast that we have. We will be looking at that in a little bit. First, only a subset of nonprofits take advantage of peer-to-peer text messaging. 23% of M&R Benchmarks participants had an active peer-to-peer program in 2023. That's comparable to the 21% that conducted phone banks for advocacy and community organizing, just to give you a sense of sort of how many groups are participating there. Several of the most common uses of peer-to-peer texting centered on mobilizing audiences to participate in real-world actions. So of those nonprofits with peer-to-peer programs, 85% of them are using them or use them to promote event attendance. 75% recruited volunteers, 68% leveraged peer-to-peer texting to support GOTV efforts. So it's not just click here to take action, click here to give. It really is trying to engage in this deeper level. And I think that's really about the one-to-one nature of peer-to-peer texting. It creates this unique opportunity to engage deeply and to begin to deepen that conversation with supporters and then expand an organizer's reach. So we actually saw that a majority, 58% of nonprofits with these peer-to-peer programs are using these contacts for relational organizing. So asking supporters to activate people within their own network, expanding that reach. Nonprofits relied on a range of senders when doing these peer-to-peer messaging programs. Paid employees sent peer-to-peer messages for 82% of the nonprofits with active programs. Unpaid volunteers texted on behalf of 52%, and 43% used outside paid contractors.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adia Ali. This is my third benchmarks, and I'm happy to share that this is the first time that we're sharing this data point on demographic information from the nonprofits. For the first time, we asked participants for information on the demographic composition of their staff, which is provided to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We received EEOC data from nearly 50% of US-based benchmark participants, which is huge. Again, this is the first time we asked for this information. But before we share this EEOC data, we'd be remiss not to mention that there are limitations and flaws inherent in it. One, it only reflects progress made in terms of racial diversity. But even that is flawed because the options are limited. For example, it doesn't include Middle Eastern or North African as options. The good news is that those categories will be added in future EEOC datasets, but the folks who identify with those racial categories do not see themselves reflected in this data now, and that's the problem. Because of these limitations, we have racial categories other than white under the umbrella of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. 2, other important identities such as disability and gender are not managed well by EEOC and therefore are not included in our analysis. And 3, the data is solely focused on representation. In other words, we don't know how nonprofit staff feel about the organization's progress in terms of equity and inclusion. But the upside of the EEOC data status that is collected consistently across US employers, which allows us to get a clear picture within the constraints of this data set. So here's the big picture. The portion of nonprofit staff who identify as BIPOC rose from 25% in 2022 to 27% in 2023. That's for staff across levels and departments, from the executive director at a national organization to the warehouse workers at a community food bank to the people who are listening to right now. At the executive and senior management level, BIPOC representation rose from 19% to 21%, a first and mid-level management. And there's a slight decline from 28% in 2022. The biggest increase came from the wide range of job categories that fall outside of management, with BIPOC employees making up 29% of all staff in 2022 and 35% in 2023. That's a pretty big deal. Many nonprofits have made a vocal commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to hiring, retaining, and promoting more people of color. As I mentioned, this EEOC data is just one measure of racial diversity and can't capture the full extent of progress toward equity and inclusion or the experiences of BIPOC staff. This kind of change takes time. There are only so many new hires or jobs overturning in any given year. The reporting in 2023 makes it clear that there is more work to be done, especially at more senior and higher paying level positions. It should not be taboo to be transparent about our diversity and equity and inclusion efforts. We're hoping that by doing so openly and consistently, we create a domino effect of normalizing these types of discussions so that we can benchmark where we are and where we're trying to do to further advance our journeys to be more anti-racist, equitable, and inclusive, because only then do we all win.
Adia, thank you for that. And Will, thanks for kicking us off. All right, we're breaking it up with some trivia here, folks, and this is you may answer in the chat. So as you know, we have a theme every year at Benchmarks. Which of the following was never a theme for past Benchmarks? Space, dinosaurs, travel, or food? Wow, very universal. I feel like we're speaking to people that we really know here. I hear you. I hear you about the dinosaurs would be awesome. I hear you. And literally everyone is correct so far. Thank you for liking the food last year, folks. It's dinosaurs. Dinosaurs was the one that we've never done yet, but never say never. It could happen. Will, what's next?
I'm starting to feel like that's kind of a dare, and I need to figure out how we can bring Diplodocuses in next year. Next, we're going to talk about fundraising, and we've got a lot to say here. So first, we're going to continue to talk about the overall year-over-year change. So as we've already seen, the total online revenue declined by 1% in 2023, pretty much flat. And so now what we're looking at is the range of experiences. So some sectors reported a similar average year-over-year change. What we're looking at here in the boxes in the middle, these are the median numbers. When you look at those numbers, the bar to the left of those numbers, the blue bar, that goes down to the 25th percentile of participants. The orange bar to the right goes up to the 75th percentile. So that is the middle chunk of participants, whether we're looking at overall or within a sector. And that's basically what you can think of as sort of the normal experience. Again, you can see that the medians don't change that much. They're all sort of single-digit changes, plus or minus, not a huge deal. But really, when you look at that broad range of what's happening at the individual level, it's a very different picture. If we look at the disaster international aid sector, we talked about how there was a 7% decline on average, and that seemed like a big deal. Here, nonprofits in the 25th percentile reported 43% less online revenue than in the previous year. Sorry, 39% than in the previous year. That is a really, really big difference. Large swings in revenue from year to year are not unusual in this issue space. High-profile humanitarian crises really drive periods of these sort of exceptional generosity, this big spike in giving. And I think what we're seeing here largely is the aftermath of a big bump in revenue that happened 2022 with the conflict in Ukraine, and then the real challenge of retaining those donors, those emergency donors over time. This is not the only issue space where this happens, but it happens more often. But if you think about moments where one particular issue comes up to the fore, you see a big spike in revenue, whether it's an emergency or an election or something else, that the longer term picture may start to look bad because the baseline is so high. When we're looking at year-over-year change, a lot of it really depends on that baseline. And so for some nonprofits, those responding to disasters, breaking news, that volatility, it's really unpredictable. The truth is that when we take a step back, the landscape still is really dominated by the big shift we saw in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Across the board, we saw an average increase of online revenue of 32% in last year, 32% that year, that first year of the pandemic. Nonprofit programs really grew, the revenue increased really dramatically. Since then, we've been seeing this sort of long-term stabilization. We're going to take a look at that big change from 2022 or from 2020 right now. This is a 4-year look back. We saw this big 32% increase. You see this at the top of the chart in 2020. Since then, it's been this stabilizing with single-digit year-over-year changes. So up 5%, down 3%, down 1%, sort of a stabilizing from that really high peak that was hit in 2020. If you look down at the part of the chart that looks weird here, that's the hunger and poverty section, which made us sort of have to rearrange where everything is, because in the first year of the pandemic, nonprofit revenue in that space in hunger and poverty increased by 465% over the course of 1 year from the previous year. The declines since then have been a big deal in dollar terms for those organizations because of that high baseline, but the percentages are obviously much smaller. You can't really understand what is happening in the last 3 years without understanding that higher baseline that occurred in 2020. So even just designing this chart became weird because it's such a weird outlier. So as we're looking at the year-over-year changes, I think it's really, really helpful to think back long-term and be thinking about the larger picture, not just what is happening necessarily in 2023. We talked a little bit already about the scale of direct mail revenue relative to online channels. Again, on average, nonprofits raise a bit more online than through the mail. It's also worth noting that direct mail revenue declined faster than online revenue last year. It went down an average of 6% from the previous year compared to that 1% decline we saw for online revenue. I think it's actually really interesting. Disaster international aid sector was an outlier here again, but in the opposite direction. While this sector saw the biggest reduction in average online revenue, direct mail revenue actually increased by 4%. So that may be about sort of how many packages are going out, that may be some of the strategic choices, or again, just so the challenges of retention online and in direct mail. Monthly giving accounted for 31% of all online revenue in 2023. That's up from 27% in 2022. Monthly giving revenue actually increased by 6%. So when we talk about online revenue declining last year, what we actually are saying is one-time revenue. One-time revenue declined by 5% year over year. Monthly revenue continued to grow. And that split, increased monthly revenue, decreased one-time revenue, was really widespread. It's something that we've been seeing for the last several years now. So this is really part of a longer-term trend. Every sector and size breakout we measured, so that difference. Only 2 sectors reported a rise in one-time revenue. That's health and public media. So this is the larger context that's affecting nonprofits really of every shape and size. Monthly giving made up 31% of all revenue. That's up again from 27%. I think this is actually really good news. Monthly giving is more reliable. Lifetime value is higher for monthly donors compared to one-time donors for most nonprofits. I think really, for me, as I'm trying to put this in the context of the work we're doing every day, I really started to think about messaging strategy. As we know that a bigger and bigger portion of our donor file is converting to monthly donors, a third, maybe more for many nonprofits, that also creates this big audience of people that we need to decide how we're going to message to. a lot of nonprofits really scale back the amount of messaging that goes out to sustaining donors. So you may not send them as many appeals, you may not send them even as many advocacy alerts. You kind of want to like leave them alone and treat them with kid gloves a little bit. And I think we need to ask some really serious questions about whether that's the best strategy. These are committed donors and an increasingly large part of the donor file. We need to be thinking about how we're staying in touch with them throughout the year, not just sort of hoping that gift continues without being canceled. This chart is very pretty. I'm going to just pause for a second and let you look at it. I think it does need unpacking. The first thing I want to point out is that we did not make a mistake and copy the same chart 3 times. This is actually looking back at 3 years of data. On the left here, we're looking at the percent of donors at different levels. So if you look at the very top, that orange bar, you see that 6% of donors gave $500 to $1,000 last year, cumulative. These are looking at only donors who gave $1,000 or less over the course of the year. We're excluding major gifts from this analysis. On the right, you see the revenue breakdown. So that 6% of donors that is in the orange bar, that they contributed 23% of all revenue. About half of donors are giving $100 or more. Those donors are giving more than 80% of the revenue. And that's how numbers work and how math works, right? Larger gifts are going to mean a bigger impact on the overall budget. That's what we would expect. That's not really a surprise. What really surprised me, what really made me question whether we needed to double check our numbers here, is how consistent the results are over the recent years. And we did double check the numbers. I see Leah and Teresa like nodding like, yes, no, this is exactly right. Yes, over the past 3 years, these numbers have not changed really at all. If you look at the yellow bars, which represent donors giving between $100 and $250, over the past 3 years, they made up 33%, 33%, and 34% of all donors. They contributed 35%, 36%, and 36% of revenue, just the same. And I find that like shocking, and I don't know what to say about it. Even as all these major world-shaking events sort of affect the work that we do, as we change our messaging strategy, as we change our targeting, as the economy changes, inflation, all the things that are happening around us, every other chart that we look at in benchmarks changes up and down year to year, except for this one. It's like this immutable law of nature. This is how your donor breakdown is going to look on average. I think there's something really, really important and deep about the nature of that consistency. This is another fun one. This is new this year as well. Donors who made only one-time gifts online gave an average of 1.2 times in 2023. So that's the average number of gifts per donor who's giving one time only. To be clear, again, this is not lifetime value. This is not retention. We'll look at retention separately. This is within year, more than one gift. Those 1.2 gifts per donor represent repeated giving within the year. And that meant the average donor who made only one-time gifts gave $165 over the course of the year. Now, the blue bars here, that's monthly donors. Those are one-time gifts made by monthly donors that gave on average 0.2 gifts over the course of the year. Some of those are happening because somebody made a one-time gift and then converted to monthly. A lot of these gifts are sustaining monthly donors who receive an appeal or see an advertisement or just go because they are inspired by what's happening in the world and make an additional one-time gift over the course of the year. So when I was talking about messaging strategy, when I was talking about how we are communicating with these audiences, there is very much an appetite within at least some part of the monthly donor audience file who is willing to make additional one-time gifts when they are asked and when they have a compelling reason to do so. So as we plan ahead and start looking toward the second half of the year, what we're going to do at end of year, this is going to be a really important part of that conversation. I mentioned overall retention. So this is year-to-year retention of one-time donors. Overall, 44% of people who gave a gift in 2022 came back and gave another gift in 2023. That's a 44% retention rate. 23% of those who made their first gift in 2022 came back. So that new donor retention rate is going to be much smaller. When we think about a big spike in giving in reaction to an emergency and then the difficulty of maintaining revenue, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the difficulty of getting first-time donors who don't have an existing history of giving to you, making that second gift. Once they've become repeat givers, once we have that habit of giving, we see that prior donors have a 61% retention rate. So getting that second gift is as important as getting the first one. I'm going to end our fundraising section here by looking at the most wonderful time of the year, end of year, December. The orange bars here represent the percentage of total giving for the whole year that came in just on the last day of the year. So that is December 31st fundraising represented 5% of the annual revenue on average. The blue bar is the last week of the year. 13% of revenue online comes in that last week of the year. And then in yellow, we see that 26% of all online revenue came in during the month of December. And I think this actually underestimates a little bit the importance of this time of year for fundraising. So first, these numbers include monthly gifts, and monthly gifts are not going to shift that much from year to year. Those hold pretty from month to month. Those hold pretty steady. So if we're looking just at one-time gifts, actually December was an even bigger deal than this. It's also worth noting that this year in 2023, the data we're looking at, Giving Tuesday fell in November because of where Thanksgiving fell, and that's going to shift to December in 2024. So we're going to see December, my guess would be a much more important fundraising month this year than it even already was, and it was already a pretty big deal. Now, just looking at these in a little more detail, we had the change in December revenue from 2022 to 2023. Overall, we saw 4% less revenue in December than in the previous year, a 2% decline in email revenue. Again, that's the full month. Now let's look at the final match deadline, that last very exciting and stressful time that we go through every year. In that final week, overall revenue was 2% lower than in the previous year. Despite a drop on 12/31, actually email revenue held steady in that final week of 2023 compared to 2022. I think what's happening here, my guess is that December 31st fell on a weekend. That's not a guess, that's a fact. Many nonprofits shifted their messaging a little bit earlier in the week out of concern that Sunday fundraising was not going to be as strong as it might otherwise be. So some of those match escalations, some of the messaging volume just went to the Thursday or Friday before a couple years. So that last week still had a really intense email experience, but it may not have been shifted quite so heavily toward the 31st. If we look just at the 31st, we saw a 7% drop in revenue compared to the last day of 2022 and a 10% decline in email revenue. Again, some of this is just about the revenue shifting, but we see that for the whole week and for the full month of December, revenue did drop somewhat. This is a sign that it's very difficult to fundraise. As important as December is, it's a very busy month. It's a very crowded inbox or news feed or your advertising. So there's a lot of work to be done here to sort of differentiate your particular nonprofit. And this is sort of the challenge that we are all facing as we look ahead to our end of year planning, which I'm sure many of you have already started.
Phew, Will, that was a lot. Thank you. Really appreciate that. That was a lot. Also really appreciate the conversation happening in the chat. Keep that up. That we actually are paying attention to that, and it gives us good ideas for other things we may want to think about for next year or as we continue to produce more webinars. By the way, if you want us to do some more deep digs on some of these, present some webinars on some particular areas, feel free to put that in the chat as well. And don't forget to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you would like to ask a question. All right. We love very unusual tchotchkes to give away when we have our parties. One of these we have never given away. Which is the one we have never given away? Interesting. Come on, keep going, keep going. Expect guesses from all of you. Wow, interesting, interesting. There have been only a couple correct guesses so far. Y'all, all right, a little bit more. Okay. Y'all, you don't remember the broccoli from last year? It's literally the Benchmarks team's favorite year for tchotchkes. We gave away broccoli along with onions and potatoes that were branded last year with little tags because our theme was food. But the one we've never done is a bow tie. But I'm now thinking a dinosaur bow tie thing is a thing. Like maybe it's a bow tie with dinosaurs on it. But we did do a custom Rubik's Cube. The rock and roll year, we shipped it with a 45 record in the sleeve. So yeah, right. A bow tie seems fun. Seems right. Okay. Right on. Let's turn it over to Johnny Benton.
Hi, thanks, Madeline. I'm Johnny. This is my 11th benchmark study, but I've been doing email fundraising for a little bit longer than that. And so I'm super excited to jump into our email section. So let's hop in. All right. Kind of big picture, very similar to what Will was sharing. Email revenue is down 7% when we look across all sectors. But that difference is experienced differently from organization to organization and from sector to sector. Hunger poverty nonprofits saw actually a 3% increase in average email revenue, while public media nonprofits reported a 17% increase. And small nonprofits saw revenue shoot up by 34% in 2023. So down overall, and I think many of the other sectors saw declines that are similar to that 7% overall drop. But even with that drop, email is still a significant part of online programs, making up 16% of revenue overall. with the environmental sector seeing the largest share of revenue from email at 22%, and public media seeing the smallest at 8%. All right, so kind of drilling down that 7% decline, where's it coming from? There's a lot of factors at play. One of the things that we looked into was email lists. Are they growing? Are they shrinking? What's happening there? So the one metric we look at is how many new people groups are adding to their lists. And what you're seeing with this metric is the ratio of how many new joins to the start of the year email list size. So another way of putting this is that 0.27 translates to groups adding 27 new subscribers for every 100 people they had on the list at the start of the year. And clearly there's a lot of variability within sectors. You can see that environmental sector, that 75th percentile. There are some groups out there that were adding more people to their list, more new joins during the year than they started the year in terms of their overall list size. Now, in the other direction, we have churn. This is the percentage of people who are dropping off a list over the course of the year. So that overall benchmark is 15.7%. And that's made up of a lot of different things, but it includes bounces, which came in at 6.7%, emails becoming non-deliverable due to bouncing, and then unsubscribes at 8.7% as well. And like many of our other metrics, there's a decent amount of variability between different sectors, with rights and environmental groups seeing more churn than other organizations out there, 20% for environmental and 25% for rights, and public media seeing the least amount of churn at just under 10%. And overall, those two things moving in the direction of people adding to the list and people churning off the list came out to 7% net list growth over 2023. That's on top of 5% the year before that and 8% the year before that. And across all sectors, most years there was some sort of email growth. The health sector saw the most consistent growth with 14% growth year over year, 3 years in a row. But again, most nonprofits, most sectors seeing some sort of email growth over the period that we were looking at. Now, the other big kind of factor in how much groups are bringing in over their email programs is how much email are they sending. On average, nonprofits sent 59 messages per subscriber over the course of 2023, with about 27 of those messages devoted to fundraising. Health nonprofits sent the fewest messages, just 28 overall, with about half of those being fundraising messages. Subscribers to wildlife animal welfare nonprofits could expect the most email, with 86 messages per subscriber. What was really interesting about that is when you kind of drill it down to fundraising messages specifically, wildlife and animal welfare organizations aren't sending more fundraising. They're just sending a wide range of different types of email at a higher rate than some of the other sectors. Public media stood out as kind of a bit of an outlier here. They sent 79 messages per subscriber, with 55 of those being newsletters on average. So not something you see in other sectors, but obviously public media being a little bit of a unique in that regard. All right, and then those were kind of the raw metrics for how much people are sending out, but that is overall the amount of email groups were sending went up from 2022 to 2023 by 12%. A lot of that growth was in fundraising emails. People sent more fundraising by 14%, smaller increases in the other types of messaging. What we always kind of are drilling into as well is, so we're sending out all that email, how is it actually performing? Virtually every individual email messaging rate went down this year. But the ones that I typically care the most about are the response rates. So I drill immediately over to the fundraising response rate, which is 0.07% people donate from getting an email. That is a value that went down 16% on average. And advocacy response rate. So typically when we're talking about advocacy response rate, we're looking at emails where people are being asked to sign a petition or email the member of Congress or a different decision maker. The response rate there was 1.4%, and that also went down about 10% year over year. All right. And that kind of bubbles up to when we look at how much money is coming in overall when we send out an email. We calculate email revenue per 1,000 fundraising emails sent at $76 being the benchmark this year. That was much higher for hunger poverty groups at $186 and lower for environmental and rights groups at $44 and $46 respectively. And this is a metric that dropped considerably, 20% down year over year from 2022 to 2023. The only sector that saw an increase was the disaster and international aid sector, and that went up just barely at 2%. So kind of bubbling up the big takeaways here on email. Email lists grew by 7%. Groups sent more email. They sent more email, about 12% more email went out. But the individual email performance dropped. So there was a 20% drop in revenue per 1,000 emails delivered, resulting in an overall revenue from email dropping 7% over the course of the year.
Oh, Johnny, thank you. For those of you who've been around for a long time, remember when email was just rising, rising, rising all the time? Those were the fun years, y'all. Those were the fun years. And also some fun years when we had unusual themes for benchmarks. Which benchmarks theme resulted in the most complaints? The 3D year, the rock and roll year, the optical illusion year, or Benchmarks X, which was our 10th anniversary. 10th benchmarks. I don't think we say anniversary. All right. Okay. I saw a couple of correct ones. The optical illusions, it could be confused with 3D, but folks, I'm going to tell you it was the 3D. And honestly, it was my favorite year, so that's sort of a bummer when your favorite year was the year that generated the most complaints. But we didn't put any of the charts in 3D. We're not cruel. Still, there were a lot of people that didn't dig it. But we can always say we shipped benchmarks one year with 3D glasses, and that is a nice thing to be able to say about a study, and not something that I think most people that produce studies can ever say. So we're making great time. We have 45 more minutes to go. We're right on time. I'm going to have turn to Teresa to talk about mobile messaging. But remember, questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A at the bottom. We're getting lots of good questions and a whole team of people answering them. And feel free to keep it up in the chat.
Hello, I am Teresa Bugeaud. I am the Director of Data Analytics at M&R, usually based in Detroit, visiting DC for Benchmarks Day today. And this is my 12th benchmark study. So I am going to be talking about mobile messaging. I'm excited for mobile messaging this year because we've collected more of this data from participants than ever before. And we have more to report than we have in previous years. So it's still a growing channel for a lot of organizations. So there's a lot of opportunity here. Okay, so Johnny just talked about how hard it is to make effective action alerts and fundraising messages in email. Mobile messaging faces many of those same challenges, but with a 160 character limit. And the audiences are smaller than in other channels. So overall, mobile audiences are much smaller than other channels, with 158 mobile subscribers for every 1,000 email subscribers. Even the sector here with the highest ratio of mobile to email subscribers was Rights. And they had 485 mobile subscribers for every 1,000 email subscribers, meaning that on average, even the Rights sector with the largest mobile list of any were not even half the size of their email list. But mobile audiences did grow by 5% in 2023, which is smaller growth than we've seen in the last few years for mobile lists, but these audiences are still growing. And some sectors, as you can see, are seeing much larger growth than others, like the wildlife animal welfare with 41% mobile year-over-year. So as audiences grew, so did mobile message volume. Nonprofits sent 40% more mobile messages in 2023 than in 2022. And volume grew for both fundraising and advocacy messages by over 50%. It's a lot more messages. But it doesn't mean that they were overloading our phones with asks and appeals, though it can feel that way. Over the years, groups sent 7.7 fundraising messages, mobile messages per subscriber on average. But as you can see, there was a wide range of volume messages, with groups in the 25th percentile sending just 1.6 fundraising messages, and groups in the 75th percentile on the high end there sending 14.4 fundraising messages in the year. And compared to email, those email volume metrics that Johnny just talked about, this is much lower volume. That's 7.7 fundraising texts. That's compared to 27 fundraising emails in that same time. But the number of fundraising messages sent matters less than the response to those messages. For every 1,000 mobile fundraising messages sent, nonprofits generated $92 in revenue. So that's 25% lower than in 2022, but it is still higher than what we saw for email, which was just $76 per 1,000 fundraising messages sent. So compared to other channels, mobile messaging is still a pretty small share of overall revenue. So there is a lot of potential here as long as groups continue to put in thoughtful strategy. And just to summarize mobile lists, they grew by 5%. Groups sent more messages, but mobile messaging is still a pretty small share. There's a lot of potential here.
Expect more about that in the future, I'm sure, as mobile messaging continues to become more important. It's certainly becoming more important with most of our clients' programs these days, especially just the last year alone. So, all right, we're going to move on to advertising. But before we do, what was the first year that the benchmark study actually first included advertising metrics? When was that? While you're guessing, I remember the first time I made a banner ad for a nonprofit was in 2002. And it was a banner ad. That's what you called it. And we were pretty excited that we got 3 clicks on that banner ad. So that was a thing. Took a while. Right on. There's some correct guesses in here. But yeah. The first year was 2015. So not even 10 years. And look how big and important it's become for most organizational programs. All right. We're moving right along, and we're going to turn it over to Sarah Coughlin for our advertising deep dive. Sarah.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah, and I'm M&R's Director of Advertising Technology. I think I'm supposed to say how many benchmarks I've done at M&R, but instead I'll just offer that I came to M&R a year out of college, and I graduated college the first year that we did ads benchmarks, and you all can do the math and feel how you feel about that. This is a really exciting year for the ad study. We're bringing back some content that was new last year, like Google Grant. We're also bringing in some new content, like benchmarks on offline non-digital ad spend. And we're also doing our darndest to figure out how nonprofits are preparing for some major changes to the ads industry. It's a really exciting set of data. I'm really excited to get into it with you. Just one quick note before we jump in. Because for the first time, we're including both digital and non-digital channels, there will be some charts that include one, some that include the other, and some that include both. I'll try to signpost it, but the chart titles will also clue you in. It'll say digital if it's just digital. Alrighty. Now, every year we ask, how did nonprofits' investment in advertising change to the previous year? And pretty much every year the answer is it grew. Some places more than others, but the overwhelming trend remains one of growth, and that is absolutely true this year as well. I have a personal theory that part of the reason for this growth is the sort of double-edged nature of pay-to-play media, because if an organization is doing well, it feels really easy to justify continued investments. But conversely, if an organization is lagging behind on revenue, it also might feel appropriate to use ads to make up those losses. And that might explain why we see some growth here, even in sectors whose revenue shrunk from the previous year, namely disaster and international aid, as well as environmental. So if 2023 was a soft year for overall online revenue, you could see those organizations being pretty aggressive and opportunistic in using ads to try to make up ground. Splitting this out by size, it is really interesting to me that small organizations grew their investments at the highest rate. That is not something that we have typically seen, but it does show up in a few different places in this year's study. I love all my children equally, but this metric is my actual favorite in the entire study. I cannot shut up about it. And it essentially asks, for every dollar that organizations raised online, what did they reinvest in digital ads? And the answer this year was 12 cents on the dollar. I love this metric so much because I think it's a really clear way of gut checking whether you've allocated the right amount of budget for digital ads. If you feel like you're spending a lot, but the budget is less than 12% the size of your expected digital revenue, you might actually still be falling behind. So I think this is a really great metric. I do just want to caveat it that it can feel easy to read this as a return on ad spend. It is not. We will look at that separately later. So if you have questions about ROAS, hold that thought. We'll be there in like 5 minutes. Here's a fuller view of that metric, and it includes the range so that you can see the amount of variation, which is pretty broad. The most aggressive small organizations are reinvesting nearly half of their online profits into digital ads. And then you've got the more conservative organizations that are only peeling off a tiny, tiny fraction. There is, again, a lot to chew on. I could talk about this for like an hour, but I think Madeline would like yank me off the webinar with a large hook if I just like camped out here. So the main thing I'm just going to say is that this is another place where we see small organizations being really opportunistic, and I think that's really fascinating. So far, we've just talked about the overall budget. Now I want to look at how it's split out by goal. And this is really clear that the smaller an organization is, the more narrowly they focus their investments on direct fundraising and to a lesser extent lead generation. To me, this is pretty intuitive. The less money you have to work with, the harder each dollar has to work. I mostly want you all to remember this in a few minutes when we look at the awareness budgets, because this chart tells you they are almost exclusively the province of large organizations. Now we're going to look at how those fundraising budgets were split up, and I want to start with a share of metrics that's a set of metrics that's actually new this year, which is the breakout of non-digital budgets by channel. Don't worry, we're going to spend most of our time on digital. We'll get there in a second, but I think this is a good place to start. The lion's share of these non-digital investments were on linear television, which is really just to say any TV spot that's purchased the old-fashioned way. Mostly, I draw that distinction because we're also going to look at connected TV in the digital section, and that is actually TV spots that are purchased digitally, essentially the same way that you purchase display and video ads. So on the consumer side, there's not really a discernible difference. It is mostly a question of how the inventory is purchased, and then to a secondary extent, how you report on its performance. For both linear and connected TV, we've also included some definitions on the slides because I think, again, this is, on some level, like it all just kind of looks like commercials, so it can be helpful to have those terms in front of you. Now let's switch over to digital. And this is where you're going to recognize the traditional online advertising channels. So social, display, and search. You're also going to see a few that are a little bit more experimental, namely digital video, connected TV, and digital audio. And again, for connected TV and digital audio, we've included definitions for those on the slides. I think digital video is a little more intuitive. It's like the videos that show up before you watch an actual video, like on YouTube and elsewhere. Pretty much every time that we look at this data, we see that organizations try to max out their spend on search. And you're going to see in a second that search is the channel with the highest returns. So that makes sense. You should spend as much there as you can. The problem is that you can only spend so much on search. There is literally a limit to the number of people who are Googling your organization's name. And so once you've maxed out, you have to figure out where you're going to put the rest of your budget. And I think it's really interesting how strong social remains here as the second place channel. Spoiler, in a second, we're going to talk about how this has changed year over year, and social has gotten a teensy bit smaller, but it has not gotten as much smaller as you would think based on how much oxygen we all devote to complaining about it. And I think that's really interesting. Everybody hates Facebook, but we cannot manage to quit it. Outside of search, you're also going to see a little bit more experimentation with display and those three channels that I noted. Again, connected TV, digital video, digital audio. And in all of those, there's a trend where the larger organizations are likelier to make space for those investments in their budget. Again, this feels pretty intuitive to me that you might have a higher degree of risk tolerance if you have more budget to play with. Here's the upside of those investments, though, in those experimental channels. They are the places where organizations are finding much more opportunity for growth relative to prior years. Display and search are both growing, but at a relatively limited rate. And Meta actually is declining, like I said, gradually, more gradually than one might think, given how much we complain about it. But really, if you're looking for opportunities to grow and to increase your budget year over year, It's got to be those experimental channels. Those are the ones that are ballooning in size. And this is admittedly a little bit speculative, so like, don't hold me to it. But if I had to put money on one of these channels in particular as the growth opportunity, I do think it's likeliest to be connected TV. And the big reason is that connected TV can run with the same assets as linear TV. Again, on the consumer side, it's sort of all commercials. And so when you think about like which channels organizations might be willing to pilot, there might be less of a lift to trying out connected TV because we know that a lot of organizations already have spots available. Whereas for digital audio or video, there might be more of a lift associated with new creative development. I also want to quickly note something very funny on this slide, which is you might look at this and ask, literally, who are the people spending money on Twitter? And all I have to say is this is the percentage change relative to the prior year. So in 2022, people spent basically no money on Twitter. In 2023, we spent 124% of basically nothing on Twitter. So it's still a tiny amount of money. Please do not interpret this to mean that like Twitter is the new frontier. It's not, and we're going to have some things to say about it in the social media section. So just put a sticky note on that and we'll come back to it. Of course, the big question is how are all of these investments paying off? And like I said, search is bringing in money hand over fist. As always, you should spend as much money on search as you possibly can. The biggest surprise to me was display, and we really thought it would look a lot worse. That's because the traditional methods of evaluating display performance are cookie-based, and those are being gradually phased out. And we thought that that would make it harder for nonprofits to quantify the impact of display ads. But it turns out the opposite is true, and display actually had the second best ROAS of any channel. Again, this was really shocking. We were all like, Teresa, can you please double check this data? And she triple checked it, and it is real. So I wanted to share a couple of theories on why. First, it is possible that enough nonprofits are getting comfortable with cookieless reporting that this is enabling them to more effectively measure the impact of display ads. Very anecdotally, I know that a lot of my M&R colleagues have put countless hours into that large project, so I'm not surprised it's paying off, and I'm really glad to see it. The other possible factor is blended campaign formats. So increasingly, Google is pushing organizations to run campaigns that blend multiple channels into one. You might hear this referred to as Performance Max. And those campaigns tend to have pretty strong returns, in part because they're serving on a lot of different inventory, and that actually sometimes includes search. But because it's a blended format, it's not necessarily clear like which channel you would report it under when submitting the data. And so I have a little bit of a suspicion that Performance Max campaigns were reported under display, and that might be slightly goosing their results. So speculating, but that's my best guess. Outside of display and search, I really want to call your attention to those experimental channels that I keep talking about. Again, digital audio, digital video, and connected TV. And there is a really wide spread in those results. And my thinking behind this is that because these are experimental, it's possible that these results represent some extremes. So you might have organizations that are doing very, very well on digital audio, and then they start dumping a bunch of money into it, and those are really overrepresented. Conversely, connected TV tends to have a really high minimum to spend, but you might have an organization that does a single expensive pilot, they're not pleased with the results, and then they pull out and they don't try it again. So that might essentially result in some sort of like wacky, skewed on both ends results. My guess is that the ROAS for those channels will sort of revert to the mean in the next few years as we see more organizations investing in them. A little bit of a guess, but something that I would look out for. That concludes the fundraising portion of the ad section. Now we're going to talk about lead generation. And a reminder, this accounts for around 10% of our total advertising budgets, and it is the only place that small organizations made significant investments outside of fundraising. Why do we care about lead generation? Because it is one of the most reliable ways to offset the inevitable churn of your email file. And this year, we found that nonprofits acquired 6 new supporters via lead generation ads for every 100 who were on their file at the beginning of the year. This is a more detailed version of that top line metric. And again, it's the box and whisker chart, so you've got a lot of variation that's immediately visible, with organizations on the fringes making absolutely massive investments in list growth, and then organizations on the far end making essentially no paid investment. When I look at this, like the thing that really sticks out to me is you take the sectors that have the smallest investments like health, hunger, poverty, public media. The most aggressive organizations in those sectors are still only acquiring at the same rate as the most conservative organizations in disaster international aid or environmental. So really what sector you're in seems to have a huge impact on just what the floor and the ceiling is. But then even within each of those sectors, there's a lot of variation. That's how many leads these organizations are acquiring. Now we're going to talk about what those leads cost. And on average, it's $3.33, which is just such a satisfying number. I love looking at that number. But again, lots of variation here. And in particular, the hunger and poverty groups are paying more than double their next closest sector. I do suspect that there's a little bit of a sort of vicious mathematical cycle here with the amount of acquisition that each sector is doing. If it's going well and you're acquiring leads cheaply, then you bring in more of them just as a mathematical fact, et cetera, et cetera. I also think there might be something going on with budget size. Recall that hunger and poverty were reinvesting their digital revenue at the lowest rate of any sector, so it may just be that the organizations with more to spend are seeing economies of scale. For lead generation, we find that it's most useful to look at our results by platform rather than channel. So these are the top 4 platforms. And just so you know, we excluded any results where we felt the data was too limited to be representative. I know Will spoke a little bit about this at the top, but that's why, for example, you see a lot of blank cells under TikTok. For the first time, we're including CPA buys as a distinct row. Because those platforms operate at a set cost, we see a lot less variation by sector. There's some variation, and I expect that that's probably just a factor of which specific platforms organizations are using, as well as whether there are any upcharges associated with acquiring SMS or doing a geo-targeted buy. But in general, really consistent results, and the cost is really hard to beat. I think the biggest strategic question for organizations is probably retention, which we don't measure here, but is almost certainly a factor when setting budgets. After that, we've got Meta. It's certainly the most consistent in the sense of more organizations are doing Meta than any others, but again, there's a huge amount of variation here, both by sector and size. We also included TikTok, and the results are extremely limited, and such results as we have show a really high cost per lead. I suspect that a lot of this is coming from limitations in what creative is allowed on the platform, as well as the relative immaturity of their ads business relative to Meta and Google. Again, I don't want to steal my colleague Alex's thunder, but we will have more things to say about TikTok in the next section. I'm going to talk a little bit about awareness now, and I just want to remind you all again that we are almost entirely talking about large and medium organizations here. Small organizations devoted just 3% of their already small budgets to awareness work. Within those awareness budgets, different channel splits than for fundraising. And in particular, you see much bigger investments in those experimental channels of connected TV, digital video, and digital audio. There could be a couple things going on here. Some of this could legitimately be that these organizations find those investments to be more valuable as awareness plays than as fundraising. Another possibility is that organizations are using awareness essentially as a proving ground for new channels. So you're not sure if you're going to do connected TV for fundraising, you try it out under your awareness budgets, and then if you get more comfortable with that channel, you might eventually migrate it into your core fundraising campaigns. Time will tell, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see organizations that try something out for awareness without imposing any fundraising expectations on it. And then as they get a better sense of both the creative and then also how to measure the impact of those investments, then maybe they move them over to the main fundraising line. One final note on awareness, we don't have robust performance metrics for this the way that we do for fundraising and lead gen. And that's really a reflection of the diversity of KPIs for awareness campaigns. So fundraising and lead gen are basically always evaluated at the end of the day in terms of return on ad spend and cost per lead. For awareness, it's a little bit broader. That work might be measured in terms of site traffic, brand lift, persuasion. And so it's just a little bit harder to pull something out across like a very wide range of organizations. To close us out, I want to talk about Google Grant. This was new last year, and I am so excited that we kept it. I think this is really, really juicy. As a reminder, the grant is a program where nonprofits are given a set budget of ad credits to buy, and I'm putting that in the world's biggest air quotes, search ads. Those ads come with a lot of restrictions. Think of it like a coupon with like the world's longest set of fine print, like a CVS type receipt amount of fine print. Now, because those ads are technically free, I like to think about them not necessarily in terms of return on ad spend, because again, the ad spend is kind of fake, but in terms of net. So for every ad credit that you spend, you're bringing in 13 cents in profit, which is fine. That's 13 cents that you wouldn't have otherwise. But it pales in comparison to the net on a paid search investment. If the return on ad spend for paid search is $2.70, subtract that dollar that you spent, you're netting out $1.70 on paid search. $1.70 is massively, massively, massively more than 13 cents. There's a little bit of variation by sector and size, but essentially we don't see anybody who is netting out from grant at anything resembling the level that they are netting out for paid search. And for that reason, I always, always, always strongly recommend organizations to think of the grant as a non-fundraising resource. You can use it for lots of things: driving qualified traffic to your site, boosting awareness of lower profile programs, boosting organizational priorities. All of those are great, and I encourage you to do it. But in the highly competitive world of specifically fundraising off of intent-driven traffic, I think it's best to just sort of bite the bullet and pay up front. To close this out, here's a quick summary of the main points for ads. Again, investments grew, organizations reinvested 12 cents into digital ads for every dollar of online revenue. Search remains king for fundraising, but with display coming in sort of shockingly close. Organizations added 6 leads for every 100 email subscribers at a cost of $3.30 on average. And then under the hood, there's just a lot of experimentation going on with new channels and tactics.
Right on, Sarah. That I keep saying to each person that was a lot, but that actually was a lot. And if it seems like we spend a disproportionate amount of time today on ads, that is in part because there is so much going on in ads right now. For those of you who are doing any kind of advertising, you know that it can be overwhelming. Sarah, thanks for untangling it for us. We're getting to the final 2 sections, and I would like to thank the organization that has participated in benchmarks the most times. Who is that? Does anyone know who that is? Is anyone from that organization on this call? I feel like there might be, but I'm not sure. Yep. All over the map. All of these are good guesses. They are all good guesses, and they seem likely, right? They seem like they would. I know, Lindsay, you'd think WWF, but no. All right. And the answer is, it is in fact Oxfam, for those of you who guessed Oxfam. Is anyone from Oxfam on this call? Because thank you for participating in the most times in benchmarks. We appreciate you. We're going to move quickly into social media with my friend Alex Hudson.
All right, thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm a vice president, and I focus on social media and influencer campaigns. And I'm excited to talk about the changes that we're seeing across the social landscape and how organizations are evolving their strategies to reach more folks and really reach them where they're spending their screen time. So the most consistent thing that we see in social media year to year is really that new platforms and communities are always popping up, and we're always keeping track of what's evolving. A lot of the organizations that we work with are frequently asking if they need to build a presence on a new social platform, how they can prioritize that, and frankly, it can be a lot to keep up with. Change in fans year over year has been one of the go-to KPIs to measure social programs, basically since social became a focus of nonprofit marketing. It's been a quick and kind of overarching way to look at a brand's ability to build momentum and recognition with audiences. And when we take a high-level look at this, these charts here tell us which platforms are capturing more interest, and they give us a look ahead into where organizations can focus their efforts. So clearly, the most noticeable thing on this slide is about TikTok. Its user base has grown a ton over the last 4 or 5 years, and benchmarks participants that do have a presence on TikTok are seeing a lot of growth as they turn their attention and begin to build up a following over there. So overall, participants averaged a 107% increase in TikTok audience size year over year. Now, just today, there's even more news about the potential for TikTok to be banned. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. But at the end of the day, vertical video has a really strong footing now as a go-to form of social content for promoting narratives and lifting up authentic stories. So that's just something to keep in mind for content strategies going forward, like with Instagram as well. So we're also seeing that while Instagram continues to grow, it's been starting to slow down in the last 4 years, with benchmarks participants seeing an average change of 11% from 2022 to 2023. And then finally, 2023 obviously was a big year of change for Twitter. Elon Musk took over in November of 2022, and we talk with clients all the time about how changes to that platform will impact their social media and their comms strategies. The big takeaway here is that in 2023, participants across the board saw a decline in audience size on Twitter. People are leaving that platform for all kinds of reasons, and engagement is lower. And it's really changing the way that nonprofits have traditionally used Twitter to support their organic social advocacy campaigns, as well as some of their earned media and PR strategies. So for example, Twitter used to be a really great place to follow the news cycle and deepen relationships with journalists. And that's really shifted since Elon Musk took over. In terms of the platforms that our participants are active on, we're starting to see more adoption of TikTok at 39% and Threads now at 32%. That's still a pretty small chunk overall, as a lot of these organizations are figuring out just how to use these platforms to their benefit. Just a note here too, Threads was only launched in summer of 2023. That was Meta's response to all the Twitter upheaval. You probably already know, but it's basically Twitter that's embedded within Instagram. We have a lot of clients that are wondering about the potential for Threads and the future of Twitter, especially if it could help fill some of the gaps that we've seen around how Twitter was once a central part of those earned media campaign strategies, or things like engaging directly with policymakers. So this year we included a set of questions specifically about how organizations are thinking about the future of Twitter. So of the questions that we asked about the future of Twitter, 88% of participants said they're still active on the platform. 62% of those have started building a presence on alternative platforms. A bunch of alternatives grew in popularity right after Elon Musk took over. Platforms like Mastodon and Blue Sky, they all seemed very intriguing at first. But once Threads was introduced, it kind of squashed the competition. So of those orgs that have started looking to migrate their presence, 90% of them said that they're exploring Threads now. And another major shift that we've seen in social strategy over the last few years is the rise of working with influencers and content creators as a core strategy of digital campaigns. The premise here is collaborating with trusted messengers who can connect with audiences outside of what we consider to be owned social, meaning content that's coming directly from a brand. Influencers can help shape narratives within movements and within communities. And we've also seen a lot of success with using influencer video content as ad creative for both fundraising and awareness campaigns. So of the organizations that activated influencer campaigns last year, 94% of them launched on Instagram, and 63% of them launched on TikTok, and 30% of them launched both paid and organic campaigns. And finally, among the organizations that launched paid influencer activations, 79% reported that they were for narrative and persuasion campaigns, 75% for driving advocacy or volunteer activations, and 50% were used to support fundraising efforts. This was the first year that we included a set of questions about influencers in benchmarks, and with the momentum that we're seeing with clients who are interested in exploring this, we're pretty excited to see how it grows in the coming years.
We have one more section left and one more trivia, the last trivia question today. Thanks, Alex, for that. Exciting new data in social media. All right, this year we had 225 participants in benchmarks. How many participated in our first study back in 2006? Put your answer in the chat. Fun fact, I was not at M&R at the time, but I participated as a consultant and brought some of my clients into the study. Interesting, interesting. Very few correct guesses so far, y'all. Very few. But yes, Oxfam was indeed one of them. This is true. All right, and the answer is, in fact, there was just 15. I know, so tiny. And now we're going to our last expert. Leah Mancuso will share some website performance data and start with a little bit of a good lecture. Right on.
Yeah. Yes. Hi, all. My name is Leah Mancuso, she, her pronouns, and I am a Benchmarks baby. This is only my third Benchmarks. But I'm delighted to get to talk to you about website analytics because we have some very important deadlines and action items related to GA4 that we want to make sure are on all of your radars. So before we jump into the wonderful world of website analytics, we must first talk about the GA4 of it all. And as I'm sure you're all painfully aware by this point, in July of 2023, Google Analytics 4, or GA4, officially replaced Universal Analytics. So with GA4, Google changed so many things, including how users are tracked on a website, how commonly used metrics are defined, the default data retention settings for custom reports, and more. And of course, they changed all of these things mid-year, leaving many of us playing catch up. And while not all change is bad, the change from UA to GA4 mid-2023 certainly makes Benchmarks website performance reporting much more complicated. So the bad news is that we have a more limited data set this year, and that we aren't able to make the same year-over-year comparisons as we normally do. The good news is that our limited data set includes the critical end of year period that is so important to many nonprofit organizations. And the even better news is that we should be back to full year reporting in the next edition of Benchmarks. So this is also a good time to mention that there is a huge deadline coming up this year related to Google Analytics. Starting July 1st of this year, 2024, users won't be able to access any of their Universal Analytics properties or APIs, and all UA data will be deleted. So here's your action item. If your organization hasn't already, save any important existing UA data before July 1st. We at M&R have put together a handy template as a model of relevant UA data to archive. I'll drop it in our chat is a link to a labs post where you can find that template, and you can fill out that template by following the Benchmarks instructions. But you may also want to discuss which KPIs are critical for your organization to track year over year and save any relevant data so that you can continue to compare those KPIs to historical performance. So it's also a good time to check that any recommended events or custom events that you want to be able to track are fully set up in GA4. And this may require the help of a developer to set up, so the sooner the better. And finally, we recommend updating the GA4 explorations data retention settings from the default, which GA4 secretly set to 2 months, to 14 months. And if you're not sure how to change that setting or how to save your UA data, we have all of that in the labs post that I linked to in the chat. All right, so now let's dive into some website performance data. Starting with one of our favorite charts, the website share by device. In November and December of 2023, desktop users accounted for 48% of nonprofit web traffic, with mobile users, which we included everything else, comprised of the other 52%. While desktop visitors were a minority of all traffic, they did generate 67% of all donation transactions and 78% of all online revenue. And while we don't make a habit of comparing last year's Benchmarks report to this year's, if you do compare this chart to last year's, you would see a very consistent pattern, which is that desktop users account for roughly half of traffic, 2/3 of transactions, and 3/4 of revenue. So, of those desktop users who made their way to a nonprofit's main donation page in November and December of last year, 16% completed a gift. For mobile users who did the same, the main donation page conversion rate was just 10%. Public media was the only sector to see a higher conversion rate for mobile users than for desktop users. Average gift at the end of the year was also higher for desktop visitors than for mobile visitors, $137 compared to $83. There was quite a wide range of average gifts by device and donation page conversion rate by device across sectors, and these differences can be driven by a combination of audience demographics and preferences, traffic sources, and nonprofit tactics to include website optimization and direct response efforts. One way that many nonprofits have attempted to increase conversions among mobile users is by adopting alternative payment platforms. So the most popular of these is PayPal, which was an option on donation pages for 67% of M&R Benchmarks participants. And Apple Pay and Google Pay were accepted by 38% and 30% of participants, respectively. And 53% of nonprofits allowed donors to give directly from a bank account. And finally, when combining users from devices of all types, the average main donation page conversion rate was 12% for the end of year period in 2023. And each participant identified their own main donation page. Typically, it's the one you land on if you click the big donate to button, probably on your homepage. And while this metric varied between sectors, we did not find significant difference between nonprofits of different sizes. So we do look forward to being able to report even more comprehensive data on web performance next year. In the meantime, again, please don't forget to save your critical UA data before the July 1st deadline. And again, you can read all about that and our other GA4 recommendations in the LAT post.
Leah, thank you for the schooling and for the data. That was great. And we really appreciate you nagging us about saving our data. That is really important for all of us who care about looking at these benchmarks over time. We have a few minutes for questions. If you have a burning question that you would like to ask the whole crowd, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll raise it up to the panelists. While you consider that, I just want to say Benchmarks is a labor of love for M&R. And I say that quite literally. Almost everyone at the company gets involved in one way or another. And every year we think, maybe we should do this every other year because it is so much work. But every year we say, absolutely, we're going to do it every single year. And we couldn't do it without the participation of this community. And when I say community, that's a capital C. This is a community. We do it in part because we want to be part of this community. We do it in part because we like to know and it helps us serve our clients better. But it really is a labor of love. Couple questions in the chat. Jill, that is a big, giant question. And in fact, I sort of feel like we should do a whole webinar on retention given benchmarks data. And I'm going to save that for that because it's a long one. I can't attend. How can I get my hands on? You have to come to an event. I cannot. Sunil, I'm so sorry. Somebody asked if we could send printed copies to the reports, and we can't. It's just not possible for us. We're remote, etc. Send a friend to one of the events. That's the best I can do. Yeah. Amber Alvarado asks, how can we help expand the amount of orgs involved? Would love to see a larger variety of orgs. We would too. I should say that before I've actually asked everyone who's crunching the data, can we handle more data? That's really a big question as well. But we would love to continue to see a variety of orgs. And for those sectors that we saw, sort of some smaller groups where we didn't have as much data in some of them, we'd love to increase those sectors as well. So if you find yourself in a sector that we don't quite have enough data to report on some of those metrics, definitely get your friends and colleagues in your sector to participate. And that Will pointed out that it's all available, including a downloadable PDF, so you could make your own book. Any more questions that you would like me to raise? All right, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking around. If you're still here, I can safely say you are our people. Thank you for sticking with us, for consuming the data, for playing along with us, and for being part of our great big community here. All of this is on the website. Go forth, have fun, and keep doing the good and amazing work you are doing out in the world. Thank you.